It's March 17th, so you know what that means. Happy St. Patrick's Day! Woo! Okay, actually, it's not St. Patrick's Day. It's the night before St. Patrick's Day, but I'm going to release this on St. Patrick's Day. But that explains why I am not wearing my green sweater. I promise I will be wearing green tomorrow. It is the day before St. Patrick's Day that I'm recording this. Tomorrow I will have my green sweater. And I also bought this fun little bow for my hair. So because this is my first St. Patrick's Day in Ireland, I will be vlogging everything that I'm doing tomorrow, so stay tuned for that. There's a really nice parade. I know there's a festival going on. My friends and I are going to try and catch some live music, so if you want to see what my first St. Patrick's Day in Ireland looks like, stay tuned, wait around for that. So today I wanted to talk a little bit about the history of St. Patrick's Day. What comes to mind when you think of St. Patrick's Day? For me, it was always leprechauns, pots of gold. Personally, I grew up in Illinois, so I always think of the Chicago River being dyed green. And along those lines, if you were born in a certain age demographic, St. Patrick's Day always makes you think of a certain movie.
Heading east to the plaza. East to the plaza? Where? Towards the Picasso? We're going east towards the Picasso.
Either way, let's talk a little bit about St. Patrick's Day and the real history behind it. So, hi, if you're new here, I'm an American currently living in Ireland, but I'm also a Christian English teacher and author. I just finished my first nonfiction book, and it focused heavily on the history of witchcraft. And within that, I did a lot of research on the history of Christianity in Ireland and the Druids that came before them, and this all relates directly to St. Patrick and St. Patrick's Day. I've also taken a lot of classes on early Irish Christianity, so I'm going to be sharing from that today. Let's get started. So first of all, St. Patrick was not Irish. This surprises a lot of people. He was most likely Welsh. In his confessions, he does say that he was later reunited with his parents in Britain. However, scholars think that he most likely came from what is now modern-day Wales. So how did he become the patron saint of Ireland if he was Welsh? Well, the truth is that he was kidnapped when he was about 16 years old. Now, at this time, it was common for the Irish to come and to kidnap people from different parts of the world and take them back as slaves. And this is actually what happened to St. Patrick. He was kidnapped when he was about 16 years old and taken back to Ireland. Now, Patrick grew up in a very, very religious home. His father had good standing in the church, but Patrick, he grew up knowing about God, but he claims that he didn't actually know God. He had no real faith of his own at the point that he was kidnapped and taken to Ireland, and he lived in Ireland for 6 years. During this time, he was with a man that used him as a sheep herder, so he would go out into the hills. And we still see this in Ireland. We have these beautiful rolling green hills where the sheep graze, and he was just out there as a sheep herder. And Patrick says that that was whenever he basically developed a relationship with God, when he came to know God. He started trusting in God, he started praying, and we know all of this because of St. Patrick's Confessions. It's the only thing authored by St. Patrick that we still have. It's actually really short. It's readily available online, and it can be read in about 30 minutes. If you have an interest in history or the history of Christianity in Ireland or Ireland in general, I would highly suggest you check it out. It's, like I said, it's really short. Something else that's really interesting about this is it's very similar to St. Augustine's Confessions. Now, St. Augustine is heralded for almost creating the first person with this really confessional style of writing. He really brought the first person out. It was very introspective. However, what's really interesting is about 50 years after Augustine wrote his Confessions, St. Patrick wrote his Confessions, and they are very similar. They both have that introspective tone. They both have that first person narrative. So it's really interesting to me that Augustine gets all the credit when around the same time, roughly around the same time, St. Patrick was doing the same thing. Now, St. Patrick most likely was not copying Augustine. He probably didn't even know Augustine's Confessions existed. So these were two little spontaneous events, and unfortunately, Patrick was second place, which is first loser. So scholars don't really talk about his contribution to the Western conception of I or the introspective literature. And I think that's sad. They definitely should. So his confession is a mixture of theology and personal narrative and reflection. It's all kind of interwoven together. It's really interesting, but this is the best glimpse we have into Patrick's life. It is the only thing we know for certain that was actually authored by him. And he tells us in his confessions that he's developing this relationship with God during these 6 years where he's a sheep herder in Ireland. And then he has a miraculous dream. And in this dream, a voice tells him that he needs to get up and go because his ship is ready. And he took this literally as a voice from God. He was about 200 miles away from the nearest port, and yet he just got up and ran away. He's like, okay, I'm going to go find my ship. He arrives at the port, and miraculously, there is a ship there waiting for him, which as a Christian, I look at that and I think, yeah, I do think this was God's intervention. I do think God was blessing Patrick and speaking to Patrick. And so St. Patrick goes to the men and says, hey, please get me out of here. And they basically told him no. So he walks away and he's confused, but he's praying. And Patrick says that as he's praying, before he's even able to finish his prayer, the men have a change of heart and call him back. From there, the confessions don't really give a lot of details. We're told that after 3 days, they reached land and then they were wandering through the land and they ran out of food. Patrick doesn't tell us why they were on the land, if that was initially part of the plan, but the captain of the ship tells Patrick, like, hey, you're a Christian, can you please pray to us because we need food? And Patrick's like, yeah, sure, I'll pray. And according to the confessions, God miraculously listens to Patrick and sends a herd of swine. They come upon it almost immediately and they're able to feed themselves. Patrick is able to make it back home. He's back to his family in Britain, which once again, remember, that's most likely Wales. He's very dedicated to God. He ends up becoming a bishop in the church. He was very well respected. Now, remember, he was not a Christian, or at least he may have claimed to be a Christian. He wasn't practicing. He didn't have that personal relationship, according to him, whenever he was first kidnapped. So there was actually a time when people came and started saying, like, hey, Patrick shouldn't be a bishop because he did all these things back in the past, and that really bothered him, but he was acquitted because he had done all those things before he was a bishop. And around this time, St. Patrick began having dreams again, and these dreams featured people from Ireland coming and speaking to him. It really reminds me of St. Paul's account of the Macedonian man. I'm actually going to read to you what St. Patrick said in his own words. He said, "It was while I was there that I saw in a vision in the night a man whose name was Victorious, coming, as it were, from Ireland, with so many letters they could not be counted. He gave me one of these, and I read the beginning of the letter. The voice was of the Irish people. While I was reading out the beginning of the letter, I thought I heard that moment the voice of those who were besides the wood of Volcut near the western sea. They called out, as it were, with one voice, 'We beg you, holy boy, to come and walk among us.' This touched my heart deeply, and I could not read any further. I woke up then. Thanks be to God, after many years the Lord granted them what they were calling." And these night visions continue. St. Patrick continues to have these dreams of the Irish people calling out to him, saying, like, hey, come evangelize us, basically. And St. Patrick, who, according to some sources, was elderly at this point. He's past what was the life expectancy at that time, which it wouldn't be too old for us now, but there was a time when 40 was, you were considered old and you were going to die soon. But he was already past the life expectancy, and he decides, like, yeah, I'm going to go on an adventure. I'm going to go back to Ireland and I'm going to evangelize them. So he gets there, and the people there were Celtic pagans or Druids. What does that mean? Unfortunately, we don't really know what that means or what the Druids were like. There are modern Druids. They practice Druidry. The ancient Druids practiced Druidism, and those two are not the same thing. Why? Well, even though modern Druidry is built out of ancient Druidry, they're definitely not the same thing, and that's simply because of a lack of sources. We know almost nothing about the original Druids. They were oral history keepers, so when the last Druid died, so did everything that could be known about them. Everything that has been recorded came from Roman sources. And usually these Roman sources portray them as these like gross, brutal, animalistic people. It said that they were cannibals, that they engaged in human sacrifices, and strangely were herb eaters. Now, I have no clue what the Romans had against a good salad, but the other claims really can't be confirmed and they can't be denied either. A lot of scholars think that the Romans were basically putting this out as propaganda, that they were saying like, oh, these people were so evil, they did this, they did that. There are accounts of Druids sacrificing humans, putting them in like these wooden structures and lighting it on fire. There are also accounts of Druids drowning people. Fun fact, where I live, there's actually this river that I cross anytime I'm trying to go any place, basically, because it runs through the middle of town. And a lot of the locals will talk about, like, back in the days of the Druids, this is where they sacrificed people. The Druids would chain people down and they would drown them here. And there actually has been a little bit of archaeological evidence to corroborate this in Dublin. You also have the bog bodies. These are ritualistically murdered bodies that have been found in bogs all over Ireland. The most famous one is Toland Man. He's famous because the Irish poet Seamus Heaney wrote a really nice poem about the bog bodies. So if you have any interest at all in poetry or Irish culture, Irish history, I really recommend you go look that up, go read it. Fun fact, some of the bog bodies were on display in Dublin. They might not be because that was a while ago. But I actually went up to Dublin with some friends and we saw the bog bodies. And fun fact, we got lost during that trip and we tried to walk in on the Irish Parliament while it was in session. And that poor security guard, like, yeah. Anyway, that's another long story. I don't have time for that story today, but if you would like to hear the story of how me and a couple American friends tried to walk in on Irish Parliament while it was in session, drop a comment below and I will make a video telling that entire story. I'll also try to rustle up some pictures of the bog bodies to stick in here. So were these bog bodies victims of the Druids? Maybe and maybe not. Like, we just simply don't know. There's been a lot of scholars that have had some really interesting ideas over them in the past. Something that I find really fascinating about these bog bodies is during World War II, the German regime that was in control at that time, I don't think I can say the name here, YouTube will flag it. They also had an interest in the bog bodies, and their scholars made some really wild and incorrect assumptions about the bog bodies, but there are some papers out there that was written on them by that regime. That's just a little extra note. What do we know about them, though? They were herb eaters, maybe cannibals, maybe they sacrificed people. Well, the Roman poets also said that they tried to inspire virtue. Not every Roman poet was derogatory towards the Druids. Some said that they inspired virtue and the worship of the gods. So there did seem to be some kind of moral structure there. The Druids were seen to be some kind of leaders. The one thing we do know for certain is that they believed in an afterlife. There's been several Roman poets that wrote about the Druids thinking about this conception of the afterlife, which is called the otherworld, which most modern Druids believe in. Actually, the largest Druid association says you have to believe in the otherworld to be a Druid because it's basically their only verified ancient belief. So what was the otherworld like? Once again, we don't really know, but the otherworld was supposedly supposed to house a lot of the different characters from Irish folklore. So the leprechaun, the puka. I don't know if you're familiar with the play Harvey, but it's about an Irish demon. If you're familiar with Harry Potter, the Grimm, like what Sirius transforms into, and the Banshee, which is Seamus Finnegan's worst fear. They both supposedly came from the otherworld, and they were creatures that you had to be very cautious of. There's actually still a lot of, I guess, like folklore in Ireland about that. You'll hear people say things like, oh, like the Banshee this and that and whatever, in that same river where the Druids supposedly drowned people in. I'd been here for about a week and someone was like jokingly telling me like, oh, it's like the Banshee or the Grimms around here or whatever. It's still a large part of the Irish cultural conception, just simply because it is part of their history and part of their folklore. So these were the people who were there whenever St. Patrick came in. How did he convert them? What happened? Once again, we don't know. What's really interesting to me is the Confessions has a giant blank spot basically in the narrative. St. Patrick's like, yeah, I was kidnapped. I came to the faith. This is how I escaped. I got home. I started having these dreams. I arrived and hallelujah, they're all safe now, which, amen, brother, but we don't really know what happened. There is a really interesting myth saying that there was a time where no one was allowed to light a fire on a certain hill. I think it was for religious reasons. And Patrick opposed the Celtic leaders by lighting this Easter fire. There's actually a really interesting children's book named Flame Over Tara about this. It does pull a lot of hearsay and it's kind of light on the facts. That's simply because we don't really have a lot of facts though. So if you're interested, I guess I would recommend it. Shout out to Lydia and Nora. Thank you for turning me on to this book. But did that happen? Was there a flame over Tara? We don't know, but that is one legend that he lit this fire and then the people came to him and were like, hey pal, what are you doing? And he's like, I'm here to share the gospel with you. And he shared the gospel with them. There's also, of course, the amazingly wild tale about St. Patrick driving the snakes out of Ireland. Now, there are no snakes in Ireland. I will say that. It's probably not thanks to St. Patrick, but hallelujah, praise Jesus, there are no snakes here. Once again, probably not thanks to St. Patrick. The one thing that we do know is that this religious revolution was most likely bloodless. Like, there was a very clean transition. The people were eager to hear, they were eager to convert, and this really challenges the assumption that the Druids were as brutal as the Romans said. Personally, I don't think they were that bad for the simple fact that St. Patrick wasn't killed and sacrificed, that he's not one of the bog bodies or he wasn't eaten in some weird cannibalistic ritual. So that makes me think that the Romans weren't quite being truthful whenever they were saying just how evil and brutal the Druids were, because Patrick came in, they listened to him, and there was a bloodless religious revolution. Another really cool thing about St. Patrick is he had a really down-to-earth and applicable method of evangelism. So his model for discipleship is he would go in and he would build relationships with local people groups and he would evangelize them. He was very careful to learn the customs, to not be affrontive. He was a Roman when in Rome, basically. That's something else that other more modern missionaries like Amy Carmichael really championed. He knew the customs, he came in, he forged relationships, and then before he left, he wanted to make sure that the Christians in the area had leadership that wasn't dependent upon him, so he would train local men to become leaders. And something that's super cool about this is there are modern mission agencies that actually still use this model. One of them is Team Expansion. My aunt and uncle, they were missionaries in Taiwan for years with Team Expansion, and that was the model that they use. So St. Patrick has given us some great lasting tools, and maybe he even contributed to modern literature, science, and Western knowledge as we know it being preserved. Though controversial, there is a book by a scholar named Thomas Cahill called How the Irish Saved Civilization, and this book argues that the monastic period of Ireland saved Western culture as we know it today. And basically the premise of this book is that whenever Rome fell and was sacked by the barbarians, which did happen, all manuscripts and knowledge in Western culture was actually being preserved in Ireland's many monasteries. And Ireland had a lot of monasteries at this point. They were producing books out of them, like the Book of Kells is one of the most famous religious texts from early Ireland. And these monasteries did have a very fruitful and long life. One of the most famous monasteries is Gaeleg Michael. It's on my bucket list. I have to go see it, but it's closed for most of the season. And I might be too much of a chicken to go there because the staircase is scary. However, if you're a Star Wars fan, you most likely recognize Gaeleg Michael because that is where they filmed the Ahch-To scenes for The Last Jedi. So there's that. Ahch-To is real and it's in Ireland. Its name is Gaeleg Michael and it is an old monastery with a very deep, rich, and vibrant history. So what did St. Patrick give us? He gave us a lot more than the holiday. Right now, he gave me a bank holiday. He gave me a day off. He gave me some traditional music. He gave the people in Chicago the guts to dye the river green. Not sure why, but he gave Ireland Christianity. Christianity was already in Ireland, but he created a religious revolution, basically, in Ireland. He gave us a model for discipleship that still works today. He maybe contributed to the Western culture being preserved after Rome fell, if we are to believe Cahill's model of Ireland's monastic culture being the one thing that kept Western culture alive during this time. So he gave us so many more things than St. Patrick's Day, so many things to be thankful for. as I close out this video, I actually want to take a moment to read from St. Patrick's breastplate prayer. And unfortunately, this most likely was not actually authored by St. Patrick. It came on so much later. There's so many I don't knows and so many whatevers, but this prayer has largely been attributed to St. Patrick. And for me, as I was writing my book over the past 5 years, my first nonfiction book, it dealt a lot with the history of witchcraft. And I came across St. Patrick's breastplate prayer, and it really spoke to me. And it got to where any day before I started doing my research, I started off by praying this prayer, and I would absolutely love to read it now. I arise today through God's strength to pilot me, God's might to uphold me, God's wisdom to guide me, God's eye to look before me, God's ear to hear me, God's word to speak for me, God's hand to guard me, God's shield to protect me, God's host to save me from snares of devils, from temptations of vices, from everyone who shall wish me ill afar and near. I summon today all these powers between me and those evils, against every cruel and merciless power that may oppose my body and soul, against incantations of false prophets, against black laws of pagandom, against false laws of heretics, against craft of idolatry, against spells of witches and smiths and wizards, against every knowledge that corrupts man's body and soul. Christ to shield me today against poison, against burning, against drowning, against wounding, so that there may come to me an abundance of reward. Christ with me, Christ before me, Christ behind me, Christ in me, Christ beneath me, Christ above me, Christ on my right, Christ on my left, Christ when I lie down, Christ when I sit down, Christ when I arise, Christ in the heart of every man who thinks of me, Christ in the mouth of everyone who speaks of me, Christ in every eye that sees me, Christ in every ear that hears of me. That's one thing I've really taken to heart. I've been asking myself as I pray this prayer, like, what should my life look like if I go out every day and Christ is in the mind of everyone who sees me and hears of me, because I'm that much of a witness. I want to be a witness that strong, and I think St. Patrick definitely does. The fact that we're still celebrating him all these years later, the fact that he has this legacy really speaks to who he was. So happy St. Patrick's Day. Go have a great day. If you're in Chicago, go look at the river. If you're in Ireland like me, go watch a parade. There's a bunch of green pastries that every bakery is selling. So I'm probably going to pretend like I'm on vacation tomorrow and eat a bunch of stuff that I probably shouldn't be eating. But St. Patrick's Day, you know, it's like the 4th of July. We're going to go all out. So have a really great day, and may God bless you. Bye.